Bill, I talked tonight about what it means if we return the United States of America to a constitutional government. And I talked about how America has been the most prosperous country in the history of the world, and that Arkansas has the ability and the potential to be a shining, should be the crown jewel in the union we call the United States of America. We've got to follow the Constitution. We've got to return the country to the Constitution. But the big question is, gosh, what does that mean? It's kind of like saying, just follow the Bible. How many different interpretations do we have about following the Bible? So I talked tonight about what it means to follow the Constitution, what it means if we return the federal government to the Constitution. And I used an acronym on the word prosper, because I think prosper is the best word to work off of for what the Constitution will mean to our country. And for the P, I talked about protecting the rights and liberties of the governed. That the reason that this Constitution was created was to create a form of government that was limited expressly and specifically to protecting the rights and liberties of the governed. We talked tonight about how as government grows, that liberty decreases. Quoting Ronald Reagan, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson said, history shows, history proves that as government expands, that liberty contracts. Then the R in prosper I talked about is restricting the growth of government. That if we're going to have a government that's limited to protecting our rights and liberties, then we got to restrict its growth, which means we got to put it on a revenue diet. The fact is that government costs too much because government's gotten too big. Kind of like me, I've been on a diet, so I've been limiting my intake. And we have got to restrict the revenue intake of government to control the growth of government. And the way we do that is through a constitutional amendment for a balanced budget, but it's got to have the element of a cap in spending. We've got to tie the government's revenue to gross domestic product, so that the government has a vested interest in the success of American business. So the way the government increases its revenue is by encouraging and creating an environment for business to be successful. And then the O in prosper, I talked about how obstructionism has got to be reversed, and how we have such an enormous bureaucracy now whose fundamental purpose and maybe not fundamental purpose, but fundamental activity seems to have become to obstruct the growth and success of business in this country. And I talked about in Arkansas that we need a governor now who's going to gather the regulators in Arkansas in a room and look at them and say, from now on, your job is to help business in Arkansas be successful. And if you can't do that, you're fired. Because we've got to have a government that stops obstructing business and encourages it. And then the S in prosper is that we've got to restore the sovereignty of the states. And that if we return to a constitutional government, that the fundamental understanding will be is that the federal government didn't create the states. The states created the federal government. And that we've got to return to the concept of the sovereignty of the state, because the United States of America is a union of sovereign states. And when we recover that, we'll see a stop in unfunded mandates. We'll see a stop in money coming from the federal government to the states with chains attached. We'll stop seeing Arkansas becoming a test ground for things like Obamacare and other entitlement programs coming out of this administration. And then the second P in prosper is to promote capitalism. If we return to a constitutional government, the fact is that we will recognize, there will be an acknowledgement of how counterproductive the redistribution of wealth is and has become. And we'll understand that the goal of charity is not to be a handout, but to be a hand up. And that we'll be doing more than helping people escape from the poverty of possessions, but we'll be helping people escape from the poverties of no opportunities, from the poverty of soul and spirit, from the poverty of being trapped in poverty. Our current welfare system traps people in poverty and indentures them to a welfare state. And included in that is the revamping of a tax code that is flatter and fairer and basically incentivizes Americans to rediscover their work ethic and the concept of personal responsibility. The E in Prosper, I said, stands for education, which must be returned to parents, communities, and states. And I talked about tonight how in 1980, America ranked #1 in the world's countries in secondary education. But on May the 16th, 1980, the U.S. Department of Education began its work. And now in 2008, there's a new study out that shows that America now ranks 18th among 36 industrialized countries in secondary education. The problem is that we have got to return education to homes and families and communities. And we've got to create a free market economy in education so that schools have to compete with each other for students and for funds, and where money follows the student. And then we'll have a quality education and a quality future for our children. And the last R that I talked about was that we've got to rediscover our spiritual roots, and we've got to restore the family in America. We've got to stop this welfare system that not only restricts or not only rewards, rather, the disintegration of the family. We've got to stop the welfare system that almost requires the disintegration of the American family. But when I talked about rediscovering our roots, I wasn't talking about some kind of a religious movement where we combat the secular misunderstanding of the separation of church and state. I'm talking about rediscovering the work and presence of God in my own heart. I'm talking about drawing a circle on the ground and getting in it and praying and asking God to send revival in that circle. If we have a return to constitutional government, those things are going to be required, and those things are going to happen, and that's what it means when we say returning to the Constitution.